October 14, 1998. 8:42 p.m. Beverly Hills just above sunset. The room is already full when the assistant checks the list again. Crystal glasses clink softly, a pianist keeps playing even though no one is listening. Agents stand in clusters, shoulders angled outward, laughing a little too loudly. Producers glance again toward the entrance, not because they expect a grand arrival, because they expect him. He is always on time. Always agreeable. Always there. Tonight, there's an empty space where his presence should already be exerting gravity. At first, no one says anything. In Hollywood, absence is impolite to notice too early. It suggests anxiety, so the room compensates. Conversations get brighter, compliments flow faster, someone jokes about traffic. Someone else checks a pager pretending that's the reason their eyes keep drifting toward the door. You can almost feel it, a low hum of expectation that hasn't yet learned it's misplaced. Across the room, a senior studio executive, gray hair, immaculately pressed jacket, leans toward an agent and asks casually, "He running late?" The agent smiles without hesitation. Of course he does, he always does. Probably, the agent says, "You know how these things go." But the agent doesn't check his watch. Because he already did. 2 hours earlier, in a quiet house several miles away, the decision had already been made. No confrontation. No phone call. No explanation. The invitation sat on a side table unopened as it had for days, not ignored, considered, turned over, put back down, the kind of object that slowly gathers weight not because of what it demands but because of how familiar that demand has become. Be there. Smile. Reassure. Be useful. For more than a decade, availability had been his most valuable trait, not talent that was assumed, not reliability that was expected. It was the simple fact that when Hollywood reached out, he answered. Dinners, read-throughs, quiet favors, introductions framed as compliments, meetings disguised as social obligations, each one small, none of them optional. And tonight's invitation was supposed to be another small thing. Just a dinner. Just a show of goodwill. Just an appearance. The kind of evening you attend not because it matters, but because not attending might. He stood in his kitchen, jacket draped over a chair, tie still hanging from its loop, and felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest, not anger, not defiance. Fatigue. Not physical exhaustion, psychological. The tiredness that comes from realizing you are no longer being invited because you are wanted, but because you are expected. He imagined the room, the conversations, the glances. He could already hear the tone people would use when they greeted him, warm, grateful, slightly relieved. And for the first time, he asked himself a question that hadn't been allowed to exist before. What happens if I'm not there? Not dramatically. Not permanently. Just tonight. He didn't phrase it as rebellion, he didn't even phrase it as a boundary. It was quieter than that, almost administrative. He sat down, took off the jacket, left the house key on the counter. And did nothing else. Back at the dinner, the pianist finishes a song and starts another. The room has adjusted its expectations forward in time. Maybe he'll arrive between courses, maybe after dessert, maybe he texted someone. But something has shifted. A producer lowers his voice and says, "That's strange." Strange is not a word Hollywood uses lightly, it's a placeholder for unease. Someone suggests a scheduling mix-up, someone else shrugs and says, "He's busy." The phrase lands wrong, he's always busy. Busy had never stopped him before. An assistant discreetly checks with the valet. No arrival. At 9:37 p.m., the executive with the gray hair stops pretending. He doesn't announce anything. He simply sits back, folds his hands, and watches the room. Because now the question is no longer when. It's why. And that question has a very long echo. What no one in the room understands yet is that nothing has gone wrong. No message has been missed. No misunderstanding needs to be corrected. No apology is coming. What's happening is something Hollywood almost never names while it's occurring. A recalibration. For decades, the industry has been built on a simple psychological equation: those who remain constantly available become structurally manageable, Not owned, but shaped. Their time becomes flexible, their resistance becomes negotiable, their silence becomes cooperation. Availability is interpreted as goodwill, and goodwill is quietly converted into obligation. Tonight breaks that equation, but so softly that it barely registers as a sound. No slammed door. No raised voice. Just a chair that stays empty long enough for people to notice they were relying on it. The danger isn't that he didn't show up. The danger is that nothing bad happened when he didn't. The dinner continues. Laughter returns, a little thinner now, deals are still discussed, promises are still implied, but beneath it all a subtle discomfort spreads, not panic, not offense. Uncertainty. Because if someone this dependable can choose absence without explanation, then something fundamental has shifted. And Hollywood hates one thing more than defiance: unpredictability. No one will confront him tomorrow. No one will accuse him. No one will even mention this night directly. That's not how power reacts when it feels itself adjusting. Instead, the industry will wait, watch, recalculate. And over the coming months, quietly, incrementally, doors will open differently, invitations will change tone, contracts will arrive with new flexibility baked in. But none of that is visible yet. Right now, it's just an empty chair. A half-finished dinner. In the first, almost imperceptible moment when Hollywood realizes someone it counted on has stopped counting it back. The next morning arrives without consequences. No angry calls. No urgent messages. No whispered reprimands passed through assistants who pretend they're just checking in. If anything, the silence is almost comforting. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. The trades don't mention anything. No columnist hints at tension. No producer vents to a reporter. The industry moves on the way it always does, smoothing over minor irregularities with routine. But inside offices across town, something else is happening. People are thinking. Not loudly, not together, individually. In glass-walled conference rooms, assistants file notes they don't quite know how to categorize. In agency hallways, junior partners replay the evening in their heads not as gossip but as data. Someone didn't appear where appearance had always been guaranteed. And crucially, no explanation followed. Hollywood is accustomed to no-shows. Flights get delayed, sets run long, personal crises are managed quietly. There's a well-worn language for absence. What unsettles people this time is the lack of narrative. No excuse means no reassurance. No story means no way to frame intent. Silence in this system is not neutral, it is interpretive space. An interpretive space is dangerous. A week passes. Then two. He doesn't vanish. That would have been legible, that would have been dramatic. Instead, he remains exactly where he's always been, available on his terms, responsive when it matters, visible without being present everywhere. He takes meetings, he answers calls, he just declines more things. Politely, briefly, without apology. I won't make it. Not this time. Let's talk later. Each phrase delivered without tension, no edge, no performance of conflict. That's what makes it unsettling. Because Hollywood understands anger, it understands demands, it understands ultimatums. What it struggles to interpret is calm refusal. Agents begin to notice it first, not consciously but tactically. Calendars open up where they didn't before. Requests that would once have been automatic now require confirmation. One agent, seasoned enough to trust instinct over data, pauses before pitching a quick favor and hears himself say, "No pressure, of course." No pressure. The phrase feels new in his mouth. Psychologically, something subtle is unfolding. For years, the star's value had been reinforced by reliability. He was safe, predictable, always cooperative. The kind of figure executives like to reference in meetings as an example of how things should work. But reliability over time can collapse into entitlement. Not malicious entitlement, structural entitlement. The expectation that access is part of the package. And now access has become conditional. The industry doesn't confront this shift directly because doing so would require acknowledging an uncomfortable truth: availability was never guaranteed, it was given. And what is given can be withdrawn. So instead, Hollywood does what it always does when power dynamics change quietly. It tests. A script is sent with a shorter deadline than usual. No response. A follow-up call is placed, not demanding, just checking. The call is returned 2 days later, friendly, interested, unhurried. A meeting is scheduled at a time that doesn't bend around anyone else's calendar. And everyone adjusts. That's the first real signal. Not resistance. Accommodation. Small, barely noticeable concessions, a meeting moved by half an hour, a deadline extended without comment, a favor quietly removed from the ask. None of these moments would register on their own, but together they form a pattern. Hollywood doesn't announce shifts in power, it leans into them. And slowly, people start leaning toward him instead of assuming he'll lean toward them. Inside his own mind, the change is equally quiet, but far more profound. For the first time in years, his thoughts are no longer arranged around expectation. He's not preemptively negotiating imaginary disappointments, not rehearsing explanations for why he might say no. The psychological pressure, the constant low-grade awareness of being needed, begins to loosen. Not disappear, loosen. He notices it in the smallest ways. He reads scripts without urgency. He considers meetings without internal bargaining. He sleeps better. This is not empowerment in the cinematic sense. There's no surge of confidence, no dramatic reclaiming of self. It's something more mature. Containment. The understanding that participation is a choice, not a tax. And that realization changes how he carries himself, even when he says nothing at all. Months later, someone finally asks. Not directly, not bluntly. A producer, careful with tone, leans back in a chair and says, "You've been selective lately." It's framed as observation, not accusation. He smiles, shrugs lightly. "Yeah," he says, "I guess so." No explanation follows. And that's the moment the producer understands something he hadn't been prepared to learn. The absence wasn't a phase. It wasn't a message. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a recalibration that didn't require permission. From that point on, interactions change, offers arrive cleaner, expectations are stated, not assumed, the unspoken understanding settles in, his time is no longer automatically available to be spent. And with that understanding comes a shift in leverage that no contract amendment could have produced. But this is only the surface effect. Because the real transformation, the one that will define his legacy, hasn't shown itself yet. That will take years. And it will begin with something even quieter. A pause. The pause doesn't announce itself. There's no press release. No dramatic gap on the release calendar. No whisper campaign about taking time off. From the outside, it looks like restraint, a thinning of appearances, fewer commitments stacked back to back, a career that seems paradoxically calmer at the very moment it should be accelerating. Inside the industry, though, the pause lands with weight. Because Hollywood is built on momentum, on the idea that motion equals relevance and visibility equals control. A star at the peak of influence is expected to convert that influence immediately into projects, into leverage, into saturation. Pausing at that moment violates an unspoken rule. It suggests you don't need to prove anything right now. And that suggestion carries consequences. The first consequence is confusion. Studios don't know how to forecast him anymore. Agents can't model his availability. Long-term slates that once assumed his participation now include question marks. A development executive flips through a binder and frowns. "We don't know if he's open," she says. Open. The word used to be a formality, now it's a genuine unknown. So Hollywood adapts. Instead of treating him as a dependable constant, the industry begins to treat him as a variable, and variables are handled with care. Scripts sent to him get better. Not louder, not flashier, better considered, cleaner, more intentional. Because when access is limited, effort increases. Psychologically, the pause creates an unexpected inversion. The pressure that once lived inside him, will this disappoint someone, will this hurt a relationship, starts migrating outward. Now it's the studios and producers doing the quiet calculus. Is this worth asking him for? Is this strong enough to justify the approach? If he says no, what does that mean about us? The burden of justification has changed hands, and no one acknowledges it out loud. What's crucial is that the pause is not total withdrawal. He doesn't disappear into obscurity, that would read as retreat. Instead, he remains visible but selectively. One project every so often, one appearance that feels deliberate rather than obligatory. Each choice framed by clarity instead of accumulation. The effect compounds. Over time, people begin to associate his presence with meaning, not volume, not reliability. Meaning. And meaning is a different kind of power. Years pass. A younger actor sitting across from his agent mentions his name as an example. He doesn't rush, the actor says, he waits. The agent nods but doesn't smile. Because waiting is not something most people can afford to do. Waiting implies insulation, from fear, from replacement, from urgency. It implies an internal authority that no longer needs constant reinforcement. That authority didn't come from dominance or demands, it came from learning how to step back without collapsing. Behind closed doors, executives begin to describe him differently. Not easy. Not dependable. But considered. A word that sounds flattering but signals something deeper. He is no longer managed, he is approached. Meetings are framed as conversations, not expectations. Timelines are proposed, not assumed. When he declines, no one asks why. Because the pause has done its work. It has taught the industry how to treat him. The most important shift, though, is invisible. It happens in moments no one witnesses. In the way he reads a script without anxiety. In the way he leaves a meeting without mentally replaying it. In the way silence no longer feels like risk. The pause recalibrates not just how others relate to him, but how he relates to himself. His career stops being a response mechanism. It becomes a position. And positions, once established, don't require constant defense. Years later, someone will try to replicate this move. They'll step back abruptly, decline too loudly, turn absence into spectacle. It won't work. Because what gave this pause its power was not strategy. It was timing. It came after years of unquestioned participation, after trust had been built to the point of invisibility, after reliability had become a given. Only then could absence register as intention rather than instability. That's the rule no one teaches. And the rule most people learn too late. By the time the industry fully recognizes what happened, it's already over. The balance has shifted, the expectations have reset, the leverage has quietly moved. Not because he demanded it, but because he stopped supplying something everyone had taken for granted. And in doing so, he revealed a truth Hollywood rarely admits. Control is not seized. It is felt the moment someone realizes they can't reach you the way they used to. The final adjustment doesn't happen all at once. It arrives in fragments, in tone shifts, in the way people phrase emails, in how long they're willing to sit with uncertainty without trying to resolve it. Hollywood learns to wait. And that may be the most unnatural behavior it ever adopts. Years after that first unanswered invitation, a new generation of executives enters the room. They weren't there that night. They didn't feel the initial discomfort. To them, this dynamic simply exists. They inherit the rules without knowing who rewrote them. When they approach him, they do so carefully but not fearfully, with respect but not submission. They present ideas fully formed, timelines clearly stated, exits gracefully offered. They don't push. Because pushing doesn't work anymore. Somewhere along the way, the industry internalized a quiet understanding. Urgency is no longer a tool that functions around him. And that understanding radiates outward. Other stars begin noticing how the system behaves differently in his orbit. They see how patience replaces pressure, how silence doesn't invite punishment, how absence doesn't provoke retaliation. They ask themselves why. Most never try to find out. Because replicating this requires something rare. The willingness to tolerate not being needed. Psychologically, that's the real barrier. Hollywood doesn't just reward availability, it conditions dependency. It teaches people that relevance must be maintained daily, that silence invites erasure, that stepping back creates vulnerability. What he demonstrated quietly without instruction is that dependency can be reversed. That the person who can withstand the longest silence often controls the tempo. Not through manipulation, through self-possession. Late in his career, someone asks him a question that finally gets close to the truth. Not about a project. Not about legacy. Not about why he turned something down. They ask, do you ever worry about disappearing? He considers it, not theatrically, just long enough to mean it. No, he says, I worry about staying too long. The answer lands heavier than the question, because it reveals the final psychological shift. He no longer measures his career by presence. He measures it by alignment. And alignment, once established, doesn't require constant reinforcement. By the time retrospectives are written, critics will frame his choices as intentional, strategic, inevitable. They'll say he always knew what he was doing. That's rarely true. What he knew, what mattered, was simpler. He recognized the moment when participation stopped being a privilege and started becoming a cost. And instead of negotiating that cost publicly, he adjusted privately. No noise. No narrative. No defense. Just a boundary placed so softly that it took years for anyone to realize it was there. Hollywood never announces when power changes hands. It senses it first. In hesitations. In deference. In the space left open when someone doesn't rush to fill it. That night, the one no article ever covered, the one no one remembers clearly, wasn't important because of what didn't happen. It was important because of what followed. A system learned it could no longer rely on automatic access. And a person learned he didn't need to be endlessly available to remain untouchable. That is the quietest kind of power shift. And once it happens, it doesn't reverse.